Or so, psychedelics have been all over the news. I've been hearing and reading stories about their use by psychiatrists to heal trauma or increase well being and maybe even enhance performance. And there are some news stories that churches are beginning to use them, which I just find completely amazing. In some ways, not so amazing. And of course, legislators in a few states are studying the possibility of either legalizing them for certain circumstances or making stricter laws against them. So it's odd that I picked that reading by Aldous Huxley weeks ago before hearing any of this. What I find really interesting about his description of his psychedelic experience was expressions, it's like phrases that he used, like flamier flames and flowery flowers, seeing the world differently, in more detail. I had that kind of experience once. I visited Frank Lloyd Wright's magnum opus, a work of architecture widely considered to be the single greatest work of residence in history. I'm talking about Falling Water, the Depression era modern masterpiece of concrete, steel, and glass that juts out over a waterfall in Bear Run, Pennsylvania. I'd been inside others of Wright's buildings, but for me, Falling Water changed everything. It changed my understanding of architecture, especially modern architecture, and its potential to change the world. And I finally understood what Wright meant when he used the term organic to refer to the built environment, especially an environment of steel and concrete. Most of all, it changed the way I saw. Specifically, it changed the way I saw light. I can't effectively describe the experience or the effect it had on my visual perception, but light has looked different to me ever since. It just feels different. Like Aldous Huxley, I had an experience of pure being when I was there in that moment and nowhere else. And I had never been more present anywhere in my entire life. I know it sounds ridiculously overdramatic, but the tiniest details jumped out at me and imprinted themselves on my soul. I can still remember the grains in the wood and stone, gentle variations in color and pattern and texture all over the building, angles of light coming in through glass and across surfaces, relationships between movable objects and fixtures of the building, and the electricity that filled the space in between them, and the energy of the millions of people who had been in that space throughout its history. I felt in my blood and my bones the energy that infused every millimeter of that space. Light looked different in that house. It looked different than it had ever looked anywhere before. And from that moment on, light, all light, including the light coming through these windows this morning, have more nuance, more variation than it ever had before that. The building placed me in history in a way that made me, for the first time in my life, aware of the power of the moment. How any moment can be nothing special at all, or it can change the world. How a moment is so tiny, its birth and death are the exact same thing, and it can make manifest all of the history that led up to that moment. And part of my experience was about the physical building, but mostly my experience was about becoming aware of everything that led up to that moment. And that moment, 1933, was the only moment in human history when that building was possible. And it happened. And I don't think I'll ever get over that. The effect it had on me was like the effect of a hallucinogenic drug opening my senses, or the effect of being in a surreal situation for an extended period. Kind of like being in a reality TV show. Now, I haven't watched a lot of reality competition shows, but I've seen a few in which participants they live in a decidedly fake environment with a bunch of people that they've never met before. And they speak to the camera in these little confessional booths, and they're sequestered from their normal lives. So really, it's no kind of reality at all. And in the ones I've seen, they're being judged and eliminated by people with seemingly dubious credentials. It seems like a cliche that at the end of several weeks of unrelenting, high pressure challenges, the final three talk about being changed by the experience. Over the last few weeks, I've been watching a show called The Big Brunch, created, produced, hosted, and co-judged by Dan Levy of Schitt's Creek fame. Now, I have no idea what makes him qualified to judge, other than being a self-proclaimed lover of Sunday brunches, just like every other gay man I've ever met. Everyone but me. I'm not a big brunch fan. If I were, I would not be a minister because I don't have a lot of time for brunching on Sunday. But something about it really drew me in. In the last episode, as the final three contestants prepared for the ultimate challenge, one said, over the last few weeks, we've had time to really slow down, to be alone, and to reflect. We have so many demands on us, we never get that luxury as chefs to really think about what we're doing and how it affects us. And another finalist said, this experience changed me forever. It changed my interior voice. It changed the words I use inside my own head. And I could see and I could hear the difference in him from the first episode. His words were more unctuous. Jerome would love that word, wouldn't he? Unctuous. It sounds like what it is, full of fat. It seems like they got the chance for a few weeks at least to indulge in a completely surreal process that changed the way they saw themselves and the world around them. They had experiences like the one I had at Falling Water, like the one Aldous Huxley had taking hallucinogens. But what really struck me most was the love in that silly program. Seriously, love in a reality competition show about food. Obviously, these are people who love their craft. And they all talked very superficially at the beginning about how food is love. And there was a lot of the required hyper masculine, chef, commercial, like restaurant kitchens are really like macho places, right? So there was a lot of like A-frame hugging and back clapping that sounded painful over mutterings of, I love you, bro. But the love that struck me was the love that was unspoken. Now, Dan Levy, I never thought about this guy ever before, but after just a couple of episodes, he became so attached to the participants, so invested in their craft and their development, that he started looking at each participant with this palpable tenderness. It was absolutely infectious. He'd say something like, did I love your raw oysters with mushroom foam? No. Then you could see his eyes well up, and he'd lean in. But I learned more about you and what you can do. And I know you are incredibly talented. You can do this. And all the machismo and male-dominated posturing started disappearing from the show. Contestants started seeing each other differently, seeing their relationships differently, their responsibilities differently. They inspired each other to do more, to be more. And everyone seemed on the verge of tears all the time, including me. It reminded me of my friend Mitra Ranama. She's the editor of a book that came out a few years ago called Centering: Navigating Race, Authenticity, and Power in Ministry. It was published by Skinner House, our UU publishing house, back in 2017. When we were in seminary, she said to me, the job of beloved community is to know what you're capable of and hold you accountable to it. And I feel like that's the way love gets expressed here in this congregation. Our covenant, the words we recite together every week, begin with love. Love is the spirit of this congregation. It's not the A-frame hugging, I love you, bro kind of love. It's the love of Reverend Mitra's beloved community, where we hold one another accountable to serve, cultivate peace, seek truth, and help. We hold one another accountable to just looking at each other sincerely and saying, I know you. I believe in you. I know you can do this. Here, for the most part, we do our best to live out our congregation as our covenant as a congregation, beginning with love. We begin with love when we take the time to reflect together on the moments that change us. We begin with love when we do what so many of us did on Friday night, experiencing chaos and conversation among old and new friends as elders and toddlers played together. We begin always with love. But it's funny, isn't it? The word love doesn't appear in the covenant of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Now, there are a lot of great words in there, right? Worth, dignity, compassion, acceptance, justice, equity, peace, liberty. And there's some powerful phrases like world community, responsible search, spiritual growth, interdependent web. Now, none of these words are as wonderful to say as vociferous, kaleidoscope, smudge, or effervescent. But when put into action, the words of our principles, they have as much power as I understand. I'm sorry. Thank you. And you matter. We put the words of our principles into action by working to undo racism, uphold democracy when it's under attack, give charitably, act peacefully, protect the planet, understand our neighbors better, try to understand those who see us as enemies. Love infuses everything in our principles, even if it isn't obvious. Now, if you're like me, you're probably asking yourself right now, if love is supposed to infuse everything we do as individual UUs and as congregations in covenant with each other, then why isn't it more explicit in our principles? The truth is, I think the fact that it's not explicit in our principles makes it a little too easy to forget the love that is there. Right now, we have all these different factions in Unitarian Universalism battling over principles. You see, a few years ago, Black Lives of UU proposed adding an 8th principle, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. And lots of congregations with the best of intentions jumped to ratify that principle and adopted it as part of our own set of 8 principles. the way we have in this congregation. Now, the eighth principle, folks, want to enshrine in our bylaws a commitment to dismantling racism and oppression, individually and collectively, but sadly, it's doomed. There's virtually no way that it will ever be ratified. The thing is that we UUs love words, and it's one of the best things about UUs, but it can also be the worst thing about us because it can be a huge hurdle. When that very wordy eighth principle was proposed, a whole bunch of folks immediately got upset because they didn't like the words. The words sounded different from all the other words in the pre-existing principles. And I have to say, I agree with that. It's not the most poetic, flowing collection of words ever, but it did something. And wordsmithing put the whole process of adopting that on life support. And meanwhile, as that dragged on, all these factions developed. So there's the fifth principle faction, which is convinced that discussion about adopting an eighth principle is inherently anti-democratic. And then there are the second principle faction that feels like their voices have been cruelly silenced by the conversation about the eighth and the fifth principles and the process of even reconsidering our principles. And in the midst of all of those words being flung into the wind, I never hear the word love, ever. And I rarely see someone receiving these words of the factions with any kind of joy. Like me, a lot of Unitarian Universalists have observed that maybe it's time to put love at the center of our principles, and they're working to change that. Now, as I've said many times, our principles are not a creed to be accepted and adopted by individual UUs. Our principles are the core of the covenant between the member congregations of our association. They're part of Article 2 of our bylaws, which is a very legal document that establishes us as a national nonprofit religious organization. And according to these bylaws, we are required to review Article 2 at least every 15 years. Now, the last time we made any significant review, which brought about the addition of our seventh principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, it was the 1980s. And the difficult truth is, the proposal to add the eighth principle wasn't really a review of all of our principles. It didn't technically meet the requirements of our bylaws. So a new commission was formed by the UUA to study Article 2 and come up with a suggestion. The commission, made up of some of the leaders of the eighth principle movement and a few other people, took the spirit of all of the principles, boiled it down to some key words, and added some of the goals of the eighth principle and came up with something completely different. And maybe some of you have seen this online. There are 7 words, and they're arranged in a circle. They're pluralism, evolution, justice, generosity, equity, interdependence, with love at the center. 7 words with love at the center. And of course, being UUs, we can't just leave it at 7 fairly poetic, densely meaningful words. There's an accompanying text of 150 words or so to explain them. But 7 words. So can you guess what happened? Oh, you can guess what happened. A whole bunch of people got angry, like really angry. And some people feel ignored. Some people feel silenced. Some people feel minimized or disrespected. There are some who are sure a grave miscarriage of justice is being perpetrated by a violent minority. There are some who speak of being robbed of liberty by elites with criminal intention. So it's not surprising, is it? The rhetoric used in the assembly of our association of congregations sounds an awful lot like the political discourse of the general population. We're a product of our environment. So in this process, not a lot of love is being expressed. And I'll talk a bit more about where Unitarian Universalism is headed, specifically in relationship to our principles, later in other sermons. The good news right now, though, is that there's hope for love, real love. You don't have to take mescaline to see it. You don't have to be on a reality show to have the time to reflect. You can just stay where you are and simply be. You can experience the isness of this place, of your life, and reflect on it with good company. Just look around at each other. Look at the faces in this room, the art in this space, the events on our calendar. Listen to the conversations after services and in committee meetings. Listen to the laughter and expressions of joy when we gather, because love is the spirit of this congregation. It infuses everything we do, inspiring us to collect everything that has meaning and beauty and to hold on to it with care. And when the time is right, to let it go so that it can bless the world. Even when it's hard, love guides us. No matter what happens in the Article 2 process, love will always guide us. So please join me now in singing number 131 in the Great Hymnal. Love will guide us.